Wesley's historic questions were about what to teach, how to teach, and what to do. For the Connectional Table's Emerging Forum, we are seeking to update these questions for our current moment. We are inviting energetic conversation that will help illumine our identity, which is tied to what and how we teach, and our preferred actions, what we do, as well as our abiding hopes as we envision the future United Methodist Church. Good morning, Harriet. I have Harriet Olson here, who is the General Secretary and CEO of United Methodist Women. And Harriet, tell us a little bit about your role in your work as General Secretary of UMW.
Thank you for the invitation, Kenitha. I'm pleased to be part of this emerging series. United Methodist Women, as you well know, is the women's mission organization within the United Methodist Church. And with that in mind, the role of the leader of United Methodist Women is always to encourage the things that are at our core. And those are spiritual growth, the sisterhood of women coming together across very different situations, and working together to serve people who are in need, particularly women, children, and youth, and to advocate for change for the systems that keep those people marginalized. So the work is a little different every day, and the connection with women across the membership, which is, we count the membership in the US, but we have United Methodist Women all around the world. And the connections with those women and our historical work for women and children brings both joy and challenge every day.
So tell me, what do you see at this particular time in the life of the church as essential to the ministry of United Methodist Women, especially as we think about the future church? What is essential about UMW's mission and ministry?
It's a really good question, and it's a wonderful time for United Methodist Women to be talking about what's essential to our work. We've just finished a season of celebrating 150 years of mission service. And as we tell the stories, we see so many similar threads throughout the history. And it really helps to illustrate what's essential. And those threads are women seeking to follow God's call. Women knowing that they are loved by God, that they are called beyond the capacities that their cultures may say they can fulfill, and women sharpening each other's call. So identifying where the work of the Spirit is taking place and helping us to see ourselves and to see the needs of the world in a profound way. And then not just learning about it, but acting on it, so that the women are saying, well, what can we do? Now that we know that women are hungry, now that we know that women lack education, now that we know that this need exists, whether it's here or someplace where we've never traveled ourselves, and maybe never can travel ourselves, what's our calling to do about it? So those threads are replete in the work. If you think about the very first story, the oldest part of our organization sent a woman doctor and a woman educator to India in 1870. The women heard the story from missionary wives on furlough in Boston. They never thought they would go to India, but they felt connected to the needs of the women there and said, what can we do? So they raised funds, which is also a through line for United Methodist Women to raise our own funds, and responded to the need. And they changed things wherever they went. It was not common to have women educated, girls educated in India, and so norms were changed. The same thing happened in China when the women came and realized how big a threat to women's health and women's agency the foot binding tradition was. United Methodist Women's predecessors were among those who challenged that. So this history of responding to God's call and challenging the systems, the cultures that we can see holding women back is something that's true throughout our history. It was true in our own denominations, the feeder denominations that are now the United Methodist Church, as we thought about women's role, women's leadership, women's ability to respond to the call to preach. All of those things are systems that were addressed by our predecessors over time. And so today, we see those things evident in, of course, the ongoing work, Mission U, learning together, praying together, challenging each other sometimes when our own giftedness, the knowledge we come with and the experience we've gained in United Methodist Women gives us something to share with others who don't necessarily see the world the same way. But it leads to the commitment to raising funds, the commitment to supporting our regional missionaries, our national mission institutions, and our commitment to looking deeper into how the systems take us to where we are today. So our commitment to the interrupting the school to prison pipeline, which is one of our signature commitments today, builds on decades of work on racial justice and the commitment to identify a place in the system where girls of color are prevented from becoming their own persons in our system, where their productive engagement with education is threatened, and taking action. Sometimes the action is on a big scale, so it's national, and sometimes, like the school to prison pipeline, it's quite local. It's addressing our own school boards and the work very close to home that we know very well. So there's a lot of threads that are in common, although the expression of the work has certainly changed over time, and how we gather, how we fund, and how we structure, that the identity is very, very consistent.
Now, you mentioned the word identity, and right now we're in a process of thinking about the identity of the United Methodist Church and the marks of the church. What do you see? What do people see when they see a United Methodist? What do people see when they see a United Methodist woman? What would you say are the marks of the church from your perspective?
I think the marks of the Methodist movement do go back to our roots in Wesley's approach. I think the very first thing that sets Methodism apart when we're at our best is this commitment and the foundation that it all begins with grace. That God's action is first. That creation is a system of abundance and mutuality, and that we're connected. Humans are connected to the whole created order that we know that God loves. And before we respond to God, before we have a name for God, before we have a concept of God, God is busy loving us into being ourselves, endowing us with capacities, and building the foundation for a fulfilled life, a bountiful life, and a generous life. And so when we're at our best, I think that it's that grace of God, and knowing that the grace is not just for me. It extends, of course, to the sisterhood. So it's one of the reasons I have to listen to the people who are talking to me, right? Because I know that sister is a woman full of grace as well. But it extends to the whole of creation. My neighbors who are very different from me, with whom I may never be able to build those bonds of sisterhood, are still blessed of God, endowed with that image of God. You know, Wesley came back over and over again to the image of God that's internal to us. I have something to learn from them. I have something to offer to them, and that together we're part of the blessedness of creation that calls us together. And that's what leads through the whole expression, right? That initial grace calls us to a life of increasing sanctification, and that necessitates the small groups. Do you know the classes and bands of Wesley's day are the units and circles of today in United Methodist Women, and that love issues in action. And so Wesley started us out by taking collections for the poor, collecting clothes, teaching children who were excluded from the schools, and challenging institutions like slavery that alienated and limited and seeked to strip the humanity of persons endowed with God's grace. So when we're at our best, those marks are very evident. I believe they're critically needed in today's world, that Methodism has a place to fulfill in the ecumenical network that is uniquely ours and that is very much needed as we seek to work together to express our full giftedness and to grow into this process of sanctification in which we're engaged, and to make the world a more fruitful and loving place.
Now, you mentioned the ecumenical world, and you're alluding to our ecumenical relationship somewhat. Tell us, how does United Methodist Women join in that ecumenical conversation?
So there were a lot of women working in mission, not quite as long ago as United Methodist Women, but pretty close behind. And so in the formal ecumenical movement, the women had a whole track, sessions derived just for them, called Women's Work for Women, at the ecumenical missionary conferences. And so women met together. In fact, even before that, before the denominations, women's organizations really formed, women often gathered together in cities and towns to work together to help the poor from church to church. So church women have always banded together locally as well as the denominations connecting. From those early times together, actually we draw the roots of what we now call Mission U. Because one of the outgrowths of that movement was the development of shared study materials, so that women would know more about their sisters around the world, and that their mission service would be better informed and would be deeply contexted in the life of faith. And so for decades, the women's mission studies were published ecumenically. And we still share, we still connect. I'm in contact particularly with some of my sisters that lead similar organizations around the denominations. And we are members of the World Council of Churches, and we work together with ecumenical organizations at the United Nations. United Methodist Women was one of the founders of Ecumenical Women, which is a place where women of faith come together to talk about the things that we would like to see in the UN declarations and in the statements, and to sort of plan for some of the work that we're about to do together. So there's a lot of historical connections which seem very normal to us today, and that also helps to shape who we are.
Harriet, I'm going to go back to something you said in a previous question when you talked about some of the racial justice work that UMW does. We have been in the midst of twin pandemics, as I've heard the term referred to, the pandemic of COVID and the devastation that has wrought around the world, and the twin pandemic of racism. How have United Methodist Women responded to both of those?
So the first thing that we know is that every emergency is the most devastating for the people who are the most marginalized. And certainly in the United States, our experience of COVID has really exposed wounds of racism that we perhaps were able to look past until this time. The So like many organizations, we've been saying, how do we intensify our work? That goes back a long time, as long ago as the Japanese internment. We see our predecessors speaking out, but I do want to mention that United Methodist Women's predecessors drafted and proposed the Charter for Racial Justice, which is now the church's charter, to General Conference in 1952. So the work is really long. But we've discovered that even though we have a lot of historical rootedness in an awareness of the work, that the way that the visibility of racism in so many system after system after system in this pandemic has taken us to a new level. Of course, women responded across the country to the immediate needs, right? So it's a service and the advocacy working together. And we had a Giving Tuesday where we specifically lifted up the needs of the pandemic. Women responded generously, and we were able to support our national mission institutions who were providing masks and who were providing food for their neighborhoods and providing places to support remote learning where children didn't have access to internet or they didn't have an adult who was available to be present in the home when schools closed. We worked with the Navajo Nation through our board member, Daryl Junes-Joe, to send hundreds of masks and money for water and other needed supplies. So women across the country and around the world began responding to needs. We're engaged in pilot projects in Africa, which were almost immediately diverted into working on producing soap to allow hand washing, as well as masks for the communities where United Methodist Women are serving. So an immediate response to the needs. And not just the needs of your own family or your own place, but thinking about the persons who are marginalized. At the same time, on the bigger issues of racial justice, we very clearly see what we've talked about, how education is most at risk for Black and Brown people in this country, how the systems don't serve us equally well, how our healthcare system fails over and over again with persons of color to support and to provide trustworthy care for those people. So we've deepened our study. We have support available with works of our own and works of others that we're promoting. We've expanded the books in the reading program because of women's hunger to know more. And we have added a new layer of responsibility to our jurisdiction leadership teams, where they are engaging side by side with the Charter for Racial Justice teams to help our organization go deeper in thinking about how we can concretely respond to the systemic roots of the racism that goes so deep. And of course, we're engaged in conversations, not just in our own organization, but in the church and in the communities where we are. So the work has been pretty wide-ranging, and we're committed. The jurisdiction leadership teams are quadrennial, so we're committed to carrying it on. It's not the work of 1 year. It's not the work of 6 months. It's ongoing work, and it's an invitation to us to take the next step in this important work that has been part of what we bring to the church and the world for so long.
In some ways, it's an extension of our discipleship and an extension of that going on to perfection, that grace at work in us, helping to transform us. As we think about the church and its future, In your opinion, what are the priorities that must guide what we stop doing, what we start doing, and what we continue doing in the next year?
So I think those are really critical questions. I think for all organizations, when you think about that, you're thinking it's important to focus on identity. We do things not because they seem like good things to do, but because we are rooted and equipped to do them. So it's not, I think, it's not the work of Methodism to be another organization, but it's to say how is this history of grace, this history of convicting and converting love, and the history of engaging in action in the world displayed at this time. So first, who are we? We might say also, along with who are we, how do we tradition our movement? Right? So how do we really take on board who we are? We want to be open and welcoming to all, and we want to be uniquely ourselves, because that is what we bring to the world. So thinking about how to share that in ways that resonate with the issues of today and the contexts of today is part of the ongoing work. So the first thing is identity. The second thing is what is the unique need of the world at this time? So a clear view of the needs in the locations of our local churches, but in the broader communities, the states, the regions, the nations where our churches are located. What's our call in view of the times today? Again, United Methodist Women have been working on in that way of thinking for a long time, to say, in the eras, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when very few women were holding political office, one of the things that we did in our leadership development track was to think about how more women could do that, and to equip people to think about roles for themselves on their community boards and school boards, and thinking about engaging in the public life. Well, we're at a different era in that. It's not that we have enough women or that all women see a way, but there are other groups now doing that work. And so that's not something that United Methodist Women is particularly carrying for this time. And I think the church needs to make those kinds of assessments as well. Where are community organizations, affiliated groups, other entities carrying this work? And where is the place where we are uniquely called to demonstrate this love and grace of God, and the belief that God is really calling us to wholeness, and to more bonds between us, not more lines between us, but more connections between us, which is what we see in if we look at the created order. We see that as God's methods of building and shaping the world.
And so I love this kind of concept of owning our identity and traditioning our identity. How do we actually live it out in the moment that is relevant? So take that idea and kind of share with us a little bit around what would we actually do differently to live into that idea of traditioning our identity in a way that would sustain vital, relevant, and effective ministry today. What do we need to do that's different than what we're already doing?
Yeah, I think one thing is to heighten our listening to where those themes are displayed in the church and in the world. So one of the things that I've said for a long time is that the liveliness of the church and the power of the movement shows up in hymnody. So rashes of new hymns and new expressions of who we are in Jesus Christ were so much a part of the movement at Wesley's time. It was so much a part of coming to new places. And I'm always looking, especially because of our mission history, I'm always looking for when in the journey of working with women around the world, songs in the vernacular mode start rising up. It's not just the songs that I bring with me, right? As from my tradition and my way of notating hymns and my music, but it's taken up by the local instrumentation and the local patterns and the speech of the people. So it's not just a question of translating, but it's a question of rooting in the receiving culture. And then giving fruit, right? So the fruit of the receiving culture then comes back and enlivens the whole. So one of the things that I think we have to do is to look for those, to look for the melodies and to look for the poems that carry this image, so that our traditioning is not, our traditioning is not so much catechesis. We have a lot to learn, reading about the history of the church and the positions, the theologies that have evolved over time is always interesting to me. But it's the poetry and the sound and the liveliness of the movement that will deepen the traditioning. I often think of the hymns and the songs and the little bits of poetry that stick in your ear as little suitcases full of theology. And we carry them. Those are the things we carry with us, right? That they're what's portable. I look for the Methodist traditioning as being rooted in Methodist ways of expressing grace and love. And it's why, frankly, I listen to new hymns and old hymns. The more I learn about the theology, I look at some of the songs that we've known for a long time and say, that's really clear that didn't come from a Wesleyan or Arminian theological perspective, right? We can learn from them, but as we really try to tradition, one of the things that we ought to be doing is looking for those kinds of portable means of theology that carry this image of love and grace and God's call and God's engagement with us as part of the movement of grace.
And that's a wonderful image of grace, our traditioning being contextualized, rooted in particular culture, but then also this sort of expansive openness to difference. So that segues me into another question. We have been dealing with a lot of difference and dissent within the United Methodist Church over the last years. How do you hope that the church will navigate that difference and dissent going into our future together?
When I think about the difference and dissent in the church, I think the first thing we need to do is have a realistic view and just acknowledge that there is difference and dissent and not emotionalize it. Right? It's a fact. There's difference and there's dissent. We're not going to address that by saying, but you can't really think that. The fact is we really do think differently and feel differently and bring our different experiences to the way we look at the issues that divide us. And we have different estimates of how core these particular differences are. So just to acknowledge that. And then to say, how do we respond at being most fully ourselves? So as persons of grace, full of grace, moving on a journey where we know we are not static. When I was 20, I didn't believe or think or feel everything that I now feel, somewhat later in my journey. And I wouldn't want to. We're not called to build stasis. We have a firm foundation, there's no question of that, but we're called to grow. If we see the Wesleyan movement as a movement of growth, then the evolution, the exposing of different points of view can be absorbed and can be addressed in a different way. So the first thing is reality. And to say that no matter our shared roots, the fact is that we have differences about this today. The second thing that I would hope for as we say, what do we then do, is that we would approach it with kindness, that we would look at each other and see other beloved children of God. We don't necessarily speak the same way. We don't, we may not end up at the same place, but we are beloved children of God. And that's what the Wesleyan theology of grace would tell us, right? That the image of God in you is just as real as the image of God in me, and I should be careful of it. So all of the people that we disagree with, and all of the people that we might feel are outside the bounds of our community, have that same image of God in them. And in fact, God is not, doesn't place the image in you and then walk away, right? God is continually calling. And that's part of what pulls us to this new place, is that evoking the yearning of God for connection with each one of us. So realism and kindness would be my first two. And then I would say a realization that delay is not our friend, that organizations don't stay static very well, and that we need to build a pathway towards a future where we can envision God's grace at work. Doing that work of looking to the future and saying how we see our identity played out in those pathways is part of what I believe will take us to a way forward that has integrity and depth. Because it's not for us a matter merely of structure. United Methodists are fine about building structures, and we can disagree with all kinds of ways, and we can see ways to fiddle and improve, and no doubt we will. But the question is about the vision, and about what's the poem that we're ready to speak to the world and to each other in the way that we move forward. So that's what I yearn for, is hearing that the far off but clear hymn, the old Quaker song, "How Can I Keep From Singing?" That far off hymn that calls us forward. That's what I yearn for.
And what a wonderful image of yearning for the poetry, for the church to speak the poetry about its identity and about its vision for the future. Harriet, those are all of my questions. What else that we haven't talked about would you want to share with us?
I think, as we've gone through this time, I have reflected some of you probably, Kenitha, and some of the viewers will know something about Lyle Shaller's work from decades ago. And I remember something that he said to me when I was still at the publishing house, which was that if the churches helped families raise their children, they would be growing. And they would be a force in their communities. And at the time I received it in a pretty mechanical way, but it stuck in my mind. So I was thinking about, okay, so that's a program, right? He was such a gifted person and a gifted observer. I think what he was really telling us was that the church needs to engage with the needs of the world, the needs of the members, the needs of the community. And the way that we were certainly during his long career, the way that we as communities connected to child rearing was quite different. He served through the whole period of time when we went from many women predominantly not working outside the home and fewer still working full-time outside the home, to a time when that totally flipped, right? And the many more, and many systems were changing inevitably because of that, including systems within the church. How are we going to build the place that addressed the new needs of the communities we serve? And of course, those needs were not new to families where the mothers had always worked to help the family survive, right? That's part of the dynamic. So, could we have learned from those churches? We could have, but we were not really paying attention that way. We were busy trying to make those churches more like the suburban churches, and all of that. So how do we see the needs of the world and know that God is attentive to those needs? God is yearning for those needs to be met. And so when we think about the needs of the community, we need to have a really new way of listening. And you may not want to do it in a sociological way, which was Dr. Schaller's view about how to do that. But some ways of really saying these are needs of the community that we, because of our knowledge of God's grace and our care for each other, are equipped to address. The poetry will carry us, but that will help to answer the questions of what should we stop doing, but what should we start? What is our call at this time? And how do we shape ourselves, our organizations, and our relationships so that we're engaging with our communities in ways that build the strength of the communities in which we're located? So I yearn for a way that the church is, that the poetry, keep saying the poetry, and the liveliness of the church is productive in the world because we carry it with us. Really, to do that, we have to stop thinking about the ordained clergy as being the vessels of that expression of church, and saying the life of disciples in the world is what will take us to a new place. We need to equip the clergy. It's vital. The traditioning is perhaps has its own expression in the life of shaping and calling clergy. But if we think about the group of 30,000 or so ordained active clergy in the United States as being the mission troop, we're thinking about the small end of the funnel. The big end of the funnel is the millions of people in church pews and the hundreds of thousands of young people who are saying, where's God calling me? And the expansiveness of the mission is to have the song of God, that poetry, that hymnody, that call of grace living in the whole discipled community, so that when we engage in the world, whether we engage as a ministry of the church, or we engage in our calling as deaconesses, or as home missioners, or as individual workers in the workplace, we're part of that mission movement, and we're part of that expressing of grace and God's love in effective and powerful ways in the needs that we are surrounded with every day.
Well, that's a wonderful image of the poetry, a wonderful articulation of the poetry, and the whole idea of the very practical expression of grace through mission in our own communities, helping families raise their children. Thank you. So thank you, Harriet. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be here.
Wonderful.